IMA folks, thank you so much for the opportunity to speak to each and every one of you. It's a pleasure to be closing out the conference here Thursday morning. Most importantly, I hope you and yours are healthy and doing well during this pandemic. So very nice to meet everybody virtually. In the time we have together, which is only about 20 minutes for this talk, I really want to summarize three important areas. And I want to tell you some stories from each of those areas that I hope will have a lasting impact on some of the takeaways and things that we've learned from this session. The first area I want to talk about is something I call intentional evolution. My quest to understand how world-class innovators and creators produce enduring work, it actually began with a calamity. But what I discovered can help you avoid making one, and it can actually lead you to great work. I began building submarines when I was in grade school. As a kid, I loved the ocean and Jacques Cousteau, and I used to dream about underwater exploration. That might not have been the best idea. You see, I grew up in a small town in Indiana called Dyer. And believe it or not, it turns out Dyer, Indiana is about 1,000 miles away from the nearest ocean. This is a photograph of one of the submarines I built as a kid. Let me point out the sophistication of this particular model. It's fabricated from two 55-gallon steel drums that I welded together after my neighbor, Mr. Held, came over and he gave me a 10-minute lesson in welding. It's powered by two electric trolling motors, one mounted on each side, and they could rotate 360 degrees independently, which let me move through the water like a fish. And that hemispherical steel nose cone, that's the top of a Weber barbecue grill. This is actually a rare photograph because just minutes later, when it was launched on its maiden voyage into a local stone quarry, it very rapidly began leaking and quickly sank 37 feet before anybody could get inside, down to the very dark, murky bottom, which actually, believe it or not, led to a discovery. You cannot learn to weld in 10 minutes. Now, fast forward through decades of work and experiences, and I was head of operations for a company, and I oversaw the fabrication and the redesign of the largest composite hovercraft ever built in the United States. Not as big as the Navy's LCACs, but nonetheless a very large vessel. And we built these and sold these around the world. Built them in Florida, actually, directly across from NASA. And this is just one example where countless incremental improvements and a lot of work by a lot of talented people eventually led to success. And it was in reflecting back on all those experiences that I realized there were strategies for moving forward that when followed would lead to success, and when overlooked, led to haphazard performance. And my pursuit of those strategies was a result of trying to drive innovation and trying to drive businesses in a bunch of different industries. And while there were certainly some real success stories, honestly, there were a lot of failures along the way. And so I've long been on a quest to discover what are the strategies that the most innovative companies and people use to create the best products in the world. And here's what I discovered. Every extraordinary performer, whether it's an organization or even an artist or a business, intentionally evolves. Now, by evolve, obviously, I'm not talking about Darwinian evolution, like Charles Darwin described in his book On the Origin of Species, published back in 1859. Darwinian evolution typically takes eons, and it's not something any of us can control. Rather, I'm talking about what I call intentional evolution, which is purposely making relentless advances. And that's something we absolutely can't control. And that's what's used by every extraordinary performer. Think of the difference between Darwinian evolution and intentional evolution as nature versus searcher. That's how I think of it. Intentional evolution is how some organizations achieve truly out-of-this-world results, and in the process, change our very understanding of what's even possible. Intentional evolution is how some artists continually reinvent their art, thereby reimagining the work that made them successful in the first place. And intentional evolution is how some businesses deliver captivating products, not just for a few years, but for decades. Now here's the thing, here's the dichotomy that we've all experienced. If you were to ask pretty much anyone, or if you were to speak with any company, they're each going to tell you they want to continually improve. But in actuality, only the most extraordinary continually rediscover, redefine, and reinvent. For them, intentional evolution, this concept I'm sharing with you, that is in their DNA. The second area I wanted to touch on is creativity. And creativity is really at the heart of everything we do as human. In fact, it's what makes us uniquely human. And when I think about how far creativity can take us, I think about the summer of 1969. But actually not Woodstock, although it would have been cool to be there. I was probably a little too young. I actually think about a small rural town in northwestern Indiana in 1969. And I think about a ghost. Well, it looked like a ghost to me. My parents had a black and white Philco TV, and along with 530 million other people, I watched in the summer of '69 on July 20th as men sitting in a metal can the size of a cramped closet had been traveling for 3 days straight at speeds of up to 24,000 miles an hour, and they were about to touch down on the surface of the moon. It was harrowing. It was an adventure in extreme, and it involved everything I loved as a kid: rocket ships and spacemen and the possibility of moon creatures. When Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin touched down on the surface of the moon, I'm telling you, and many of you remember this, the entire world rejoiced. And some minutes later, the entire world held its collective breath again when they opened up the hatch to that lunar module, and Neil Armstrong climbed down that ladder, and took his historic first step on the surface of the moon. Like all incredible accomplishments, this began with an audacious goal. When, believe it or not, just 7 years earlier, President Kennedy said, "We choose to set sail on this new sea because there's new knowledge to be gained and new rights to be won, and they must be won and used for the progress of all people." I realize that in some measure this is an act of faith and vision because we do not yet know what benefits await us. Now, interestingly enough, a short while after this was broadcast around the world, there were some people, a small percentage of people, but nonetheless some people, who, believe it or not, they said the whole thing was a hoax. And they said it was filmed by Stanley Kubrick. He was the director of 2001: A Space Odyssey, a movie that was made the year before. They said Stanley Kubrick filmed it on some back lot in Hollywood. And that just struck me as crazy. Some people think that. But then, believe it or not, there were other people who had an even more diabolical idea. They said that, yeah, that was true. Stanley Kubrick did film it, but he was such an exacting and a demanding director that he insisted it be filmed on the actual surface of the moon. So at the time, I wasn't even sure if that was a conspiracy. Now, for those of you that are interested in conspiracies, I'll share with you one that I discovered. But be forewarned, like all good conspiracies, it's been hiding in plain sight the entire time. Once you see it, it can't be unseen, and you'll never forget it. So if there are any timid souls among you here today watching this, for the next 15 seconds, maybe just look away. Very simply, if you take the name Neil Armstrong and you simply flip it around backwards, coincidence? I'll let you decide. When NASA was ramping up for the moon landing, they hired a scientist named George Land to help them identify their most creative employees. And using this assessment, NASA applied it internally to their company, not just to their engineers and scientists, but to their project and program managers, even to their administrative folks. And they found that 2% of all the NASA employees scored at what they termed a creative genius level. And once identified with this assessment, these folks were put into positions where their creativity could be applied. And it worked out great. I mean, it helped us land on the moon and return safely back to Earth just 7 years after getting started. And all the innovation associated with the space program, it drove many spin-off technologies. Things like cochlear implants that allow deaf people to hear, scratch-resistant lenses, freeze-dried food, infrared ear thermometers, vascular heart bypass operations, aircraft anti-icing systems, memory foam, and solar panels, to name just several, of literally over 100. To solve the many challenges of landing on the moon and returning safely back to Earth, NASA intentionally evolved by continuously innovating. Now, there were a lot of benefits that came out of the space program, some of the ones I just touched on. But there's arguably something we learned that's every bit as important as any of those spin-off technologies. And it very likely may not be something that you're familiar with. But you should be aware of it because it could have a real impact on your work and it can have a real impact on your life. Decades after George Land was involved and helped NASA identify their most creative employees. Well, decades later, he was retired, and he was invited to visit his granddaughter's kindergarten class to meet with the kids. And you'll recall this assessment found that 2% of their employees at NASA scored at the creative genius level. And almost on a whim, George Land brought with him the same assessment to the kindergarten class used at NASA. These kids were 5 years old. He was shocked to find that 98% of these kids on the same test scored at the creative genius level. He went back 5 years later when the kids were 10 years old. He had them take the assessment again. This time, 30% scored at the creative genius level. And he went back one more time, again, another 5-year increment, when the kids were 15 years old, had them take the test. This time, 12% scored at the creative genius level. George Land joked they stopped testing at 15 years of age because the results were so depressing. And you can see George Land give a TED Talk on this. In fact, I'm using many of his slides from his talk. This has since been repeated many times by others on hundreds of thousands of children, always with generally the same results. And it indicates that the way we educate and the way we socialize our children actually diminishes their creativity. But the good news is George Land knows how this can be stopped and actually reversed, and we can regain our creative genius. And we can do so fairly readily and fairly quickly. First, we have to generate an abundance of ideas. Secondly, withhold criticism. And lastly, exercise our creativity. A good reminder is to use more awe. And that thinking will help us regain our creative capacity. So let's take a little break and let's take a look at how creativity impacts us and how we think about things. Let's have a little bit of fun. I want to share with you an image. I want you to take a look at it. Tell me what you see and which way you see it spinning. You ready? Here we go. who saw a cat? That's great, because that's what hopefully we'd all see. Who saw the cat spinning this way, right? And how many of you saw the cat spinning this way? Okay, watch it again. Now it's interesting because you really can't tell which way that cat's spinning because it's a silhouette. So in actuality, you don't know if it's facing you when it starts out or if it's facing away from you. But if for whatever reason you imagine it facing you, it'll look like it's spinning this way because its paws come out this way. But if you imagine it facing away from you when it starts, it'll look like it's starting to spin this way. Here's what's interesting. The more times you watch this cat, trying to interpret which way it's spinning, the more difficult it becomes, almost impossible it becomes to see it spinning the other way. And I know this is the case because I've had executives beg me to show it to them 20 and 30 times, which I've done, and they can never see it spinning the other way. And the point of this fun little exercise is that this is a habit that all of us form with our thinking. We continue seeing patterns and we interpret them the same way, and we fail to see what else might be happening. And this actually can have a real impact in the real world. Take, for example, ice. Well, who can tell me what's happening here? This is how ice was harvested 150 years ago. They'd go out into a frozen lake with horses, and they would cut big blocks of ice. They'd cut them into smaller chunks. They'd store them, and they would transport them on wagons to people's ice boxes into their homes. And then what happened? Well, then we learned how to industrialize ice manufacturing, commercialize ice manufacturing. And now people could get ice if they lived in Florida, if they lived in sunny California, even in Wisconsin if it wasn't the wintertime. And then what happened? We learned how to miniaturize the manufacturing of ice, and we had cool orange refrigerators that people could have in their homes. Here's what's interesting. There were dozens of companies that harvested ice this way, employing hundreds of people. And they knew more about ice production than anybody. How cold it had to be, how the wind contributed to the freezing, where to get the cleanest ice on the lake, how to keep the blades sharp, how to store the ice for the longest period of time, how to efficiently deliver it. Yet not one of these companies transitioned to become a commercial ice manufacturer. And there were dozens of these companies around the country, and they knew more about making ice than anybody, what kind of refrigerants and gases to use, how to cut the blocks of ice, how to deliver the blocks of ice, how to purify the water. Yet not one of these companies transitioned to become an appliance manufacturer because they'd all continued seeing the world in which they were familiar, like we saw with the exercise of the cat. So the question we have to continually ask ourselves is, how can we improve our creativity? I want to close out in the next minute by once again thanking everybody for inviting me here. I want to really just sort of touch on the future and bringing everything in together that we learned and applying it into your work of military aviation. A few years ago, I had the pleasure of meeting Buzz Aldrin. You'll recall Buzz was the second astronaut to walk on the surface of the moon. He stepped out of the lunar module about 15 minutes after Neil Armstrong took that historic first step. The two of them spent over 2 hours exploring the surface of the moon, collecting soil samples, putting up the flag. When they got back to the lunar module, Buzz Aldrin was the first astronaut to climb back up and get inside the spacecraft, followed by Neil Armstrong a short while later. Buzz Aldrin remains in good health. He's a big advocate for continued exploration, for continued development. You'll often see him wearing a t-shirt that says, "Get your ass to Mars." He's got a great sense of humor. He said, you know, Neil was the first human to set foot on the surface of the moon. But I'm the first alien from another world to enter a spacecraft that was headed to Earth, which I thought about, and I guess that's true. Here's what I would leave you with about the future. I hope you set big, audacious goals like we did for the space program. I hope you intentionally evolve. I hope you set lofty goals, and in doing so, I hope you remember the sky is not the limit. Despite what the conspiracists say, there are actually real footprints on the surface of the moon. Thank you very much. I look forward to being in touch with each and every one of you and speaking with you again. Take care. Stay healthy.